Greetings of the day, everyone. I'm privileged to welcome you all into the third edition of Orange City Literature Festival, organized by SGR Knowledge Foundation, in association with GS Raisoni University, powered by Raisoni Group of Institutions. I am Rishika Multani, delighted to be your anchor for today's session, curtain raiser for Tuhin Sinha's new book, Birsa Munda, by Mr. Tuhin Sinha. In conversation with Mr. Vaibhav Purandare. Mr. Tuhin Sinha is a best-selling author, screenwriter, and politician. Tuhin Sir is acknowledged among the most prolific Indian writers with a maverick knack to experiment with new genres. He has authored 11 books now. His last release, Mission Shengzhan, was a geopolitical thriller set against the COVID pandemic. Sir's magnum opus, The Legend of Birsa Munda, is outlined for a political release in December 2021. One of the first books, When the Chief Fell in Love, released in February 2018, had outlined a political solution to the Kashmir dispute, which was uncannily similar to the one initiated by the Indian government on August 5, 2009. Mr. Tuhin's book travels a wide range of genres and includes socio-political thrillers and romantic sagas. He has also written extensively on all political issues, including Kashmir. It's an honor to have you with us, Mr. Tuhin.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this gets even more delightful as we have Mr. Vaibhav Purandare, who will be in conversation with him as the moderator. Mr. Vaibhav Purandare is a senior journalist and author of 4 books. His latest book, Hitler and India, the untold story of his hatred for the country and its people, published by Western Books, came out this year. His other best-selling books are Savarkar, the true story of father of Hindutva, Sachin Tendulkar, a definite biography, and Bal Thackeray and the Rise of the Shiv Sena. He is currently senior editor with the Times of India and has worked with the Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, and several other publications in the past. I once again welcome you, Tuhin Sir, and I welcome you with us. Also, before moving ahead, I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the support of Anonymous Manjul Publication as their association is valuable to OCLF. Now, my dear audience, you are about to experience a conversation between two prolific individuals. So without skipping a moment, I humbly invite Mr. Vaibhav Sir to lead us in.
Thank you, Rishika, for that very nice introduction. And good to be in conversation with you, Tuhin Sinha, on your new book. 11 books, quite a prolific body of work. And congratulations on your
Thank you.
forthcoming
Thank you.
book on the legend of Birsa Munda. I'd like to start by asking you, Tuhin, that Birsa Munda is one of the less known freedom fighters of India. For a majority of Indians, in fact, the question that may first arise is who is Birsa Munda? And why should we be discussing his life and times? And what's the significance? So what made you select Birsa Munda as a subject? And who is he really? If you could tell the vast majority of Indians about him.
Thank you, Rishika, first of all, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Nagpur Literature Festival, for this opportunity. And thank you, Vaibhav, for readily agreeing to do this session without, having the time to read the book. It has been really kind of you. So, Birsa Munda is one of India's biggest tribal freedom fighters, who in a short lifespan of about 25 years from 1875 to 1900 shook the might of the British Empire in the interiors of present-day Jharkhand, which was then a part of Bengal presidency.
Mhm.
So, the thing is, when you feel you've traveled the world, you tend to look inwards. So
Yeah.
after writing on a whole lot of exotic issues and contemporary issues, I was struggling to find the motivation for the next subject, something which would excite me for the next few years.
Mhm.
And interestingly, this phase coincided with a larger change in social and national narratives that you see unfolding in the country. It's a fact that it's a fact that history has been partial towards mainstream politicians, mainstream leaders. It is a fact that India's subaltern freedom movement has been largely ignored, despite the fact that it dates back to almost 1767.
Mhm.
The place where I have grown up, Jamshedpur, is about 70 to 80 kilometers away from the epicenter of Birsa Munda's revolution. So
Okay.
throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s, Jamshedpur is a very compact industrial town, but still one would keep hearing the term Birsa because there was Birsa Nagar in the heart of the city.
Mhm.
Ranchi Airport, which is about 120 kilometers away from 120 kilometers away from the city, has a famous Birsa Munda airport. So one would keep hearing the term Birsa Munda, but in all my growing up, in all my formative years, one would struggle to find credible material on the legend. But thankfully, post 2014, the impetus which the present government, which the Honorable Prime Minister has provided to this subaltern movement, which largely remained ignored, also made me think of revisiting or kind of actually doing up my research on the movement. And it's a very fascinating movement. So in a short span of 25 years, from battling the regular battles which the entire community was battling, and in fact, I'll tell you, in tribal areas, the the enemies were twofold for the
Mhm.
villagers. On the one hand were the wily zamindars, on the other hand were the missionaries,
Mhm.
because the Britishers ten- tended to employ multiple weapons to entrap the tribals into their stranglehold and to keep
Mhm.
them tied up in knots all their lives. But both of these enemies, the
Mhm.
missionaries who would indulge in forced conversions, compulsive conversions, and the zamindars would eventually report to the British administration. So their direct fight wasn't with the British administration; it was with the twofold enemies, which were invariably, acting at the behest of the British administrators who were operating from cities like Ranchi in those days and from Kolkata.
Right.
So this was a very layered battle.
Mhm.
This was a very layered battle. There were, and there was a big number of mundas or the tribals who would, in search of a better livelihood, be compelled to convert because they were given sops like the moment you convert, we'll take care of your debts and we'll handle the zamindars for you.
Mhm.
But then the missionaries were eventually financed and supported by the zamindars. So it was a vicious circle which would never end, and even the people who would convert would eventually realize that at the end of the day, it was just an entrapment. So
Okay.
Birsa Munda's family also went through all of these. They
Mhm.
converted. Birsa Munda, in fact, was sent to a missionary school in Chaibasa, 100 kilometers away from his home, to study. But at the age of 15, he rebelled. He came out of it because he realized that, all of that was trampling the Adivasi culture which they subscribed to. And finally, after being in hibernation where nobody knew where he was, it was later discovered that he was under the tutelage of a spiritual guru, Anand Pandey, in the jungles. He re-emerged in 1894 after 4 years in a completely different avatar where people would see him invoking godly powers. He could cure people, you know, in all likelihood, perhaps he was given knowledge about herbs and medicinal herbs, because the person who, unfortunately, not much is known about his mentor, but he was supposed to be a very learned medical practitioner, come spiritual guru who was very well versed with Hindu texts, Mahabharata and Gita. But people in 1894 saw a completely different avatar, and within a span of 1 year, that village of Birsa Munda turned to be a virtual tourist spot where people would throng in hundreds from far-flung places in those days just to get a darshan of Birsa Munda.
Okay.
The British Empire was rightly insecure about it. So, to begin with, this was not a freedom movement. This was not a political freedom movement. It was an entire spiritual movement, a movement aiming at reforms for the tribal community. But when he was wrongly charged with sedition and put behind bars and eventually convicted and sent to jail for 3 years, when he came back in 1897, and that was when he planned a violent revolution, which eventually took place 2 years later in 1899. But in a span of 10 years, the kind of destruction which they caused to British establishment in the region virtually shook the might of the British Empire. And, today, I think across states, whether it is Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, or Bhubaneswar, or Orissa, in all of the adjoining states, he's celebrated as an icon of Adivasi might and somebody who's, organized and mobilized the Adivasi community in a big way.
Right. That sounds fascinating, because here's this folk hero, a tribal hero, a rebel against the empire, and he takes on the empire at this very young age and poses immense difficulties for the empire, for such a powerful empire. Now, here is a remarkable figure, one of India's pioneering freedom fighters, you could call him. At the same time, for all the remarkable nature of his rebellion and his popularity in a certain number of states, he has been ignored across the rest of India. Like you mentioned initially in the conversation, that we hardly have read about him in our school and university textbooks. And our academia and our mass media and in the broader public discourse, we haven't really read much about him or heard much about him, or even seen any sort of visual communication about his life and times in terms of a series, a television series, or a movie, or anything of that sort. Now we have our academics, our Indian academics, who talk about subaltern movements all the time. And we have the mass media, of which I am a part, which also talks about the poor and the underprivileged and the tribals. So then, why do you think, as Birsa Munda remained such a little known figure across India, in spite of his heroism and in spite of his remarkable sacrifices during the freedom struggle?
Well, I think there are two reasons for it. One is history, anyway, has always been written from the point of view of rulers. So even when I was researching on the subject, there were so many different versions insofar as his personal life is concerned. People were aware of his, of his movement from the time he became a public figure, but there is very little credible material or authentic material of the time preceding that movement. So it is genuinely difficult to document the lives of people whose lives were not being kept a tab on, or whose lives were not being streamed.
Right.
The second is obviously,
effectively, Tuhin, you are answering my next question to you also, which was going to be about sources. About such a little known figure outside his own region. So please go on. Yeah.
So, sorry, what's the next question?
No, it was going to be about the sources for documenting his life. For
Right.
such a little known figure, a
Huh.
figure who's little known
So
outside
ideally,
of his own
this
region.
this book, even though the idea had been growing in my mind for a good 3 years, it
Right.
eventually took off during the first lockdown, March
Okay.
2020.
That's interesting.
And
Okay.
the first for the first drive, I had obviously I have a co-author who wrote the book with me, and based upon my inputs, based upon my pointers of chapter planning, she did the first draft.
Uh-huh.
So ideally, I would have liked to travel, a little more. But then I was not sure when the lockdown would be off, and because I had been off writing for a long time because of parallel political career in which I was entrenched in, I thought
Right.
this is the best time to quickly bring out a book. So I
Yeah.
referred to, I think, about 50 articles across the internet on Birsa Munda.
Uh-huh.
Honestly, again, many of them were conflicting. You know, they were contradicting each other.
Okay.
Then there are two books again. One by an IAS officer, K.S. Singh, who had served in the region during the 60s and the 70s,
Uh-huh.
and another book by a journalist based in Ranchi. Both of these were, I think, written 30, 40 years ago. But then
Okay.
that was about the credible information that I managed to gather. Plus, I spoke to villagers. I have, because I have been in the region, I spoke to people who have lived in the region. In fact, I spoke to a very senior ex-MP, Kariya Munda, who has been an MP for 8 terms,
Right.
from a constituency called Khuti,
Uh-huh.
which is where Birsa Munda's village is.
Okay, great.
And because he belongs to the same clan,
Yeah.
he had a lot of information about the actual life of Birsa Munda. So
Right.
I have depended upon speaking to people from the region, from his village, and plus a whole lot of material available on the internet, and that is why I felt that since unlike you, I'm not a historian. I tend to I thought it would be safer for me, and also and also a more rational thing to do to dramatize certain portions of the book. So while Birsa's journey is presented in as much a credible manner as I could, the secondary characters, the villains, have been, a certain amount of imagination has gone into creating the characters around him.
Okay. Okay.
So that's how the book shaped up. And I think we started writing in March, and the first draft was ready by November, and then obviously it's been a long editing process.
Okay. Okay.
The publishers thankfully had enormous conviction in the book, Marilis, which has a Hindi imprint called Manjul. So right at the time of signing the contract, they had readily agreed to bring out the book in multiple languages. So post English, it comes out in Hindi, Marathi, and Gujarati. And then hopefully I'm talking about to a publisher in Jharkhand for a tie-up in the local Santhali language, which is the Adivasi language of that region.
That's very interesting, because it will be great to have this book in multiple languages across India, so that more and more Indians get to know about him. So are you effectively saying that the paucity of information on Birsa Munda was the principal reason for his being little known outside the region that he worked in?
Two reasons. One, like I felt, like I have juggled with multiple books, and I employed my intellectual or creative honesty to come to the conclusion that it would not be fair for me to write a completely non-fiction book based on the my aptitude or my previous work. The second is, eventually one wants cinematic adaptation of these subjects, because no matter how much a book sells, no much how much you publicize it, at the end of the day, the audiovisual adaptation is what takes it to magnifies its impact manifold. So I had that in mind right at the start, at the time I started writing the book. In fact, you'll be surprised, every week now for the last 3 or 4 weeks, ever since I've been talking about it, I have been getting feelers from one producer or the other. But then
Okay.
I'll tell you,
Lovely.
I know a friend who has directed a movie on Birsa Munda, probably the only
Mhm.
movie on Birsa Munda, which released in 2005.
Okay.
A guy by the name of Ashok Sharan. But the
Okay.
thing is, if you don't get a good producer for a movie like this, it's better the movie does not get made,
Yeah.
because cost cutting and on a low production scale, the
Right.
the movie would not work. That is the kind
Right.
of scale, that is the magnitude of the 10-day revolution which Birsa championed towards the end of 1899.
Right. Right. Oh, sounds very interesting. Tuhin, if I were to ask you that from the sneak preview that I got about your book, uh, I could figure out that, here's a man who comes from a deeply entrenched tribal culture. Like you mentioned initially, his family is also gradually converted to Christianity. And there are these two massive influences that you mentioned. One is the zamindari system, and on the other hand, there is tremendous missionary activity happening in the area. And like you said, Birsa Munda himself gets converted at a certain age and is sent to a missionary school. So, what is the point at which he really becomes a rebel, or what is the trigger for his rebellion against the entire system, whether it's the zamindari system, the activities of the missionaries, and the British Raj, the broader British Raj? What
So,
was the
I'll
trigger?
have to take you back to about 1820s, because the story
Uh-huh.
actually, most of these revolutions need to be seen in continuity.
Correct.
So,
Absolutely.
in fact, through two successive books, I'm attempting at this point of time, probably by the end of the third book, which releases in 2023,
Uh-huh.
I might be in a position conclude with some amount of authority that
Okay.
1857 was not the first war of independence. And
Okay.
even if it were to be called the first war of independence,
Uh-huh.
I think the precursor were in many of these subaltern battles which were being fought from, at least 50 to 60 years before that. So
Okay.
in
Okay.
and most of these battles were taking
Yeah.
place in the interiors.
Uh-huh.
So in 1820, around 1820, the first of these revolutions, called the Coal Revolution, was again launched in the same region
Mm-hmm.
by a group of tribals. Then 1855 was the Santhal insurrection, which was launched
Mm-hmm.
maybe 200 kilometers north of that region.
Mm-hmm.
But all of these revolutions had led to many scattered, fragmented revolts slash revolutions, which were emanating, but was also dying down in a couple of years because of multiple things.
Right.
One, cash crunch. Eventually, they were vulnerable to conversions, and the moment they would convert, the cultural identity would be gone.
Mm-hmm.
So, around the time that Birsa became a rebel, which was in 1890,
Mm-hmm.
after his family had converted, after he had converted, but after being after having studied in a missionary school for 4 years, he realized that it was a trap. All of this would subjugate the Adivasis even more, and he would never come out of it. So that is where he had a skirmish with one of the missionary fathers, preachers, and
Mm-hmm.
the major skirmish ends resulted in him leaving the school forever.
Mm-hmm.
But why his movement also worked was that in the initial stages, when he launched himself, or when he became famous as a social preacher or as a social reformer, the kind of clout, the kind of following that he generated was unprecedented for many of the scattered, tribal movements which had been preceding him. So
Okay.
from 1857 till then, there was some
Mm-hmm.
sort of a jinx where many of these movements would die. But suddenly,
Mm-hmm.
and these tribal leaders would converge in a group and call themselves Munda Sardars, and but all of them were lying low till he became that successful in 1895-96, and they started approaching him to relaunch a violent movement.
Okay.
So in a way, I think the fact that his social reformation avatar
Yeah.
preceded his political warrior avatar
Right.
added an extra audience base, or added a mass popularity which many of the preceding Munda Sardars were lacking in.
Right.
And all of them eventually converged, accepted him as a hero, rallied behind him, and eventually that resulted in a movement which the region has not seen before. Probably it was even though the duration was small, the scale of the revolution was akin to 1855 Santhal insurrection, if not the 1857 War of Independence.
Right. You speak of the assault on tribal culture by outsiders. Could you give us some examples of the nature of this assault? Which Birsa Munda is actually rebelling against? What was the kind of assault that took place during that period?
See, the Adivasi practices are very layered. In fact, I'm glad that would enable me to take you on a different subject altogether. So now, obviously, there is a lot of discussion fueled by certain political interests on whether Adivasis are Hindus at all. Now, this was a zone where, again, I had to delve a lot into my sources of research and find out the truth. So the worship of Shiva in forests dates back to maybe, it's 1,000 years or even before that. But then at the same time, they may call Shiva by their own name, by a different name, like Singabonga is the name of their god. So there is a gray zone over there wherein they subscribe to a whole lot of Hindu practices, but then have many of their own.
Okay.
And that is largely on account of the habitat. That is my conclusion. If I were to spend the next 2 years in a forest, obviously I would start worshipping nature a lot more than I do being in a city. But nature worship, any which way, is an inherent part of Hinduism. So some people, even in contemporary politics, have been fueling the theory, have been for the vested interest that Adivasis were never part of. And obviously the communists, communists and the Marxist historians love these theories. So I think that's one aspect of it which has been covered in the book. But when I talk about the cultural dominance, see, a lot of zamindars, again, they had settled in the region, but probably they belonged to either the present day Bihar or the present day Uttar Pradesh.
Okay.
So their language was different from the Adivasi language.
Okay.
The Mundari language or the Santhali language, which was prevalent in that region. So I think language was the core, means of dominance, or something which clashed between the tribal population and the non-tribal population. Besides, of course, the missionary zeal with which missionary zeal for conversion, which some of the more fundamentalist fathers employed. And these were what had created a situation of unrest, or led to a situation of unrest in the tribal regions.
Okay. And when Birsa Munda becomes popular in his region, like you say, his social reforms movement, and then there is the political movement. So what's the high point of this movement? Is there violent action against the British Raj, like we saw in 1857? Is there a violent uprising because of which he becomes this folk hero in the tribal region?
So the violent revolution was the end revolution, after which he was arrested and actually died in mysterious circumstances. But the fact is that he had attained a cult status as a spiritual / social guru.
Right.
And by 1895, his village would be thronged by thousands of people every day. In those days, where commutation and conveyance were actually difficult from one village to the other, people would
Right.
actually, have lodges. Lodges would thrive in those areas just to house pilgrims who would come for their darshan. And
Oh,
this is
okay.
where the Britishers became very jittery and had him jailed on wrong charges of sedition. But till that point of time, in 1895,
Uh-huh.
even though he was being approached by other tribal leaders to launch a violent protest, he had never anticipated, or he had never really planned a violent protest. It was the
Okay.
2 years that he spent in jail from roughly November 1895 to 1897. And those
Uh-huh.
2 years also coincided with the worst famine in that area, and
Right.
also the strengthening of the dominant pressure tactics of Britishers, where a whole lot of unnatural deaths occurred during those 2 years. So when
Right.
he came back with vengeance, he came back with a zeal,
Uh-huh.
and he was finally prepared for a violent movement. But
Right.
that again, the planning and the organization eventually took 2 years, and finally it unfolded in December on the eve of Christmas in 1899.
Uh-huh.
He
Okay.
was arrested after a 10-day revolution. He went into hiding and finally was arrested on 3rd February.
Uh-huh.
I know this because thanks to Man Ki Baat, a whole lot of dates are now, I think because of the Prime Minister's attention to detail, a whole lot of
Right.
dates are now known to people.
Uh-huh.
And finally, after being put to jail in February, he passed away in the first week of June and under very mysterious circumstances. So the theory is that he was killed, he was gradually poisoned, even though
Uh-huh.
the official cause of death was known as cholera. But then his death was mired in history in much the same way that Lal Bahadur Shastri's death was mired in mystery for many years. And even
Okay.
now, nobody is actually certain about the cause of death. People still
Okay.
believe that he was gradually poisoned to death over a period of a week or 10 days.
Oh, so one of the earliest this must be one of the earliest mysterious deaths
Yeah.
in the Indian national movement, and of top Indian leaders.
Yes.
Of course, in the post-independence era, we've known of Lal Bahadur Shastri, we've known of Shama Prasad Mukherjee, we've known of Deen Dayal Upadhyay. A very strange manner in which they
So,
lose
so,
their lives.
so in
But
fact, that's what makes the story all the more fascinating. Even the death
absolutely.
was as mysterious as the life.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It makes for a fascinating life, and like you said, it's a short life, but an action-packed life, and full of tension and conflict and rebellion. So when we look at the popularity of Birsa Munda in his own regions and during his lifetime, especially when he becomes this cult figure, I'm sure a lot of national leaders at that time would have been aware of his activities and the rebellion that he had sparked in that region. Did you come across any references to Birsa Munda made by some of the top leaders at that point in time? Some of the top leaders of India's national movement, freedom movement at that point in time?
See, I wouldn't know if he was so popular during his lifetime outside the region,
Okay, okay,
because the 2 years of planning that
right.
went into his revolution was more of a guerrilla warfare, where
Uh-huh.
the people, whenever there would be an incident, a violent incident in the village, while the police would be investigating it, his team would be hiding in another village, or somewhere deep into the forest.
Okay,
So,
okay.
it had all the elements of guerrilla warfare of the topmost kind.
Uh-huh.
So, but I'm not sure whether these things were reported exactly beyond the region, beyond being on a need to know basis.
Right,
Because at the
right.
end of the day, the more these incidents would get publicity, the more it would unsettle the British movement in other parts of the country. So Britishers anyway had a very condescending attitude towards tribals, whom they would
Right.
treat as less as lesser beings. I guess the Britishers, beyond being administratively aware of what was unfolding, did make a conscious effort to ensure that the information did not pass on to other places where they could
Okay.
actually fuel simultaneous protest or simultaneous revolution.
Okay. 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 So that in itself is an interesting aspect of his life that, uh, even during his lifetime, the rebellion that he triggered uh, remained not so well known outside those regions. And
Besides,
yeah, yeah,
besides, I think the final revolution also took the Britishers by surprise.
yeah. Okay.
So
Okay.
that 10-day, the scale of destruction which had happened, and
Uh-huh. So
hats
was
off.
he planning it all in secrecy?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So for the last post 1897, after he was released, I think after a
Uh,
few months after he was released in 1897, he
uh-huh.
was virtually in hiding,
Okay.
and it was a secret war which was being planned in fragmented manner across the villages. There were people, there were informers who would inform his party, and most of it was happening deep inside the jungles. There is a particular region, which kind of forms a triangle between Jamshedpur, Chaibasa, and Ranchi. So
Okay.
even at this point of time,
Uh-huh.
I haven't been to his village, but I do hope to, visit the village in February once the Hindi edition is out and present
Mm-hmm.
the first copy to his descendants. But even now, the place where the final war was fought,
Uh-huh.
the most eventual war, that is a place that is called Dombari Hills.
Uh-huh.
Even now, it is an absolutely far-flung area, not linked to any of the main connecting highways.
Okay. Oh.
So that will tell you how, guerrilla warfare, secret guerrilla warfare was planned successfully without even the Britishers knowing much about it or
Right.
anticipating it adequately.
Right. Right. And if I may ask you, Tuhin, you talk about those 10 days, those crucial 10 days, without giving out too many details of your book, because, the reader should really go out and buy and find out all the details of that drama from your book. Could you give us some idea of what happened during those 10 days, those 10 eventful days?
So there was a very planned attempt at destruction of government properties,
Uh-huh.
and which also included religious properties. Religious properties.
Uh-huh.
There was a bone of contention between the top leaders of the movement on the government properties religious properties should be targeted, but then a whole lot of it was happening as a reaction to the murders of three or four very important members of the movement in
Mm-hmm.
the weeks preceding the revolt. So this was a particularly bloody movement where they came out with vengeance. It started with an assault on a church
Uh-huh.
on the eve of 25th
December.
December.
Mhm.
But within a span of by next noon,
Hmm.
it was only by around next noon that the Britishers got to know that similar attacks have taken place in a radius of 50 kilometers
Okay.
all over.
Okay.
And the scale of destruction was enormous. Government properties were targeted. So, in fact, the final confrontation, in fact, one of the key antagonists of Birsa Munda's fight
Uh-huh.
was a Christian missionary by the name of Father Hoffman. And in
Okay.
fact, German missionary was planted in that region
Uh-huh.
from early 1850s as one of the components of the British plan to subjugate the Adivasis. But
Okay.
towards the end of 1890s, this particular priest had become so dominant
Mhm.
that he eventually became one of the core antagonists of Birsa's fight.
Okay.
And it's very surprising, it's very interesting to note that a whole lot of Adivasi reforms, which had been held back by the Britishers
Uh-huh.
prior to his movement, were eventually unleashed post Birsa Munda's death.
Okay.
which includes a very important Chota Nagpur Land Tenancy Act, if you may like to Google it, for protection of the land of Adivasis. So
Okay.
this was one of the most significant reforms which happened in the years succeeding Birsa's movement, but had been held up for a very long time and had resulted in this revolution.
Right. So this is the impact that he has after his life, after the end of his life as well.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, I mean, the most beautiful or the most interesting part is that in that short span of 25 years,
Huh.
you know, like I said, I'm not sure how many people knew him or would have known of his movement beyond that region.
Right.
But the character basically grew after his death.
Yeah.
And even today, I think I think the peak has not been reached. The kind of inquisitiveness, the kind of curiosity that kids have about him now, or even people across the country have about him now, I think it will take a few years before his story reaches every household and eventually reaches the history books.
Right. And Tuhin, I do believe and I really hope that your book plays a very big role, and in fact, the biggest role in popularizing his story and making it known to readers across India. Because here is a pioneering freedom fighter who fought the British and yet has been largely ignored by historians. The preview that I had of Tuhin's book made it very clear to me that here is a compelling story, and Tuhin has written it in a compelling fashion. It's a fascinating story, and it reads like a story, which is actually the best part of history writing. Tuhin, you said you're not a historian, but I really believe that the best history is the history that reads like a story and not like some stuff that is unintelligible to the general reader.
Well, that's a big, huge compliment coming from a historian. Thank you.
So I do hope that readers will go out and buy this book because Birsa Munda deserves to be well known. The battle that he fought against the British deserves to be much better known than it is now. And Tuhin's writing itself, I think, makes the book worth reading. I think. And thank you once again, Tuhin, for this very interesting conversation, which has thrown a lot of light on his life, and it will help generate greater curiosity about this historical figure, whom now slowly getting to know about finally, outside of the Chota Nagpur plateau and, outside of the regions where he is already well known. So at least the rest of India will get to know him through this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav. I think one, for your time, and two, for your for genuinely, taking interest in the subject, because, like I said, there are too many unknown characters from history springing up all of a sudden.
Correct.
And I think it takes a curious, inquisitive mind to really get into it. So thank you for the interest. Thank you, Nagpur Literature Festival, Orange City Literature Festival. You've always been brilliant, very cooperative, very kind, and very supportive. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that insightful session. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Tuhin Sinha and Mr. Vaibhav Purandare for joining us today. We wish we get to hear you both again and be equally enlightened as we all are today. And for my dear audience, I am sure that after witnessing this conversation, you all are taking home an enriched version of yourself just as I will. Thank you for joining us today. Until I see you again, this is Rishika Multani signing off.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
vision beyond.